This opening slide frames copper as a strategic global asset, rather than just another industrial metal. The presentation's central idea is that copper is becoming a critical bottleneck for the global economy because it sits at the center of electrification, AI, energy transition, and infrastructure. The four themes introduced here are important. First, copper is reshaping the economic landscape. Second, its strategic value is rising sharply. Third, it is now central to both the digital economy and clean energy. And fourth, this creates major investment implications. This slide sets up the broader case that copper demand is no longer just cyclical. It is becoming structural and increasingly strategic. This slide explains why copper's importance is growing. Copper remains one of the best large-scale conductors of electricity and heat, which is why it is so difficult to replace in core industrial applications. It is a critical economic cornerstone for power systems, manufacturing, transportation, and communications infrastructure. The key point is that substitutes often reduce performance and reliability, while also increasing system costs. That gives copper a unique economic role. In practical terms, when electrification expands, copper intensity rises. This is why copper is not just useful, it is often irreplaceable in the exact sectors growing fastest. This slide introduces the four overlapping demand drivers powering the copper story. First are AI data centers, which add a new source of copper intensity through power systems, cooling, and cabling. Second are electric vehicles, which require far more copper than internal combustion vehicles. Third is power grid expansion, likely the most underappreciated demand driver, because all these technologies require stronger transmission and distribution networks. Fourth is renewable energy and electrification, which depend heavily on copper in generation, transmission, and integration systems. The key takeaway is that copper demand is being driven by multiple structural growth engines at the same time. This slide focuses on AI data centers as a major new copper demand driver. Copper demand from data centers is shown rising from about 1.1 million tons in 2025 to 2.5 million tons by 2040. That is a meaningful long-term increase. The reason is that AI facilities are copper-intensive in several ways. Internal cabling, transformers, busbars, cooling systems, and internal power distribution all consume large volumes of copper. On top of that, the facilities need major external grid connections, which add even more copper demand. The key point is that the AI build-out is not just a chip story. It is also a major infrastructure and materials story, and copper is one of its core inputs. This slide explains why EVs are such an important copper demand engine. A conventional internal combustion vehicle typically contains about 20 to 50 pounds of copper, while a battery electric vehicle can contain roughly 85 to 180 pounds. That means BEVs can use several times more copper per vehicle. The increase comes from electric motors, battery packs, bus bars, inverters, power electronics, and much heavier wiring systems. Beyond the vehicle itself, charging infrastructure adds another layer of copper demand through public chargers, home charging units, and broader network upgrades. The main takeaway is that EV adoption drives copper demand not only in cars, but across the charging ecosystem too. This slide highlights power grid expansion as the unsung hero of copper demand. The IEA identifies electricity networks as one of the biggest future sources of copper demand, with annual copper demand for grids rising from about 5 million tons in 2020 to 7.5 million tons by 2040. That is crucial because AI, EVs, industrial electrification, and renewables all depend on stronger, more resilient grid infrastructure. This means copper demand is not just about the end products people focus on. It is also about the massive network beneath them. The takeaway is that copper demand increasingly comes from the infrastructure layer, not only from consumer or industrial applications. This slide broadens the electrification theme. Copper demand is rising not only from renewable generation itself, but also from the systems needed to move and manage that electricity. Clean energy generation relies on copper in wind turbines, solar systems, and associated equipment. Transmission and distribution require major conductor build-outs. Grid modernization adds another layer, because resilience, efficiency, smart systems, and integration of intermittent power all require more copper-intensive equipment. The important point is that the energy transition drives copper demand across generation, transport, and system integration at the same time. This is what makes the demand story so powerful and persistent. This slide shifts to the supply side and shows why demand may outpace supply adaptation. The IEA highlights copper as one of the biggest critical mineral problem areas in the energy transition. Demand is shown rising roughly 30% by 2040, while announced project supply fails to keep up. The chart suggests an implied mine supply shortfall of about 30% by 2035 relative to demand. That is a very important number because it means the project pipeline does not currently look sufficient. The market may therefore tighten well before long-term peak demand is reached. This is one of the clearest arguments for higher copper prices over time. This slide makes the shortage story more immediate. The key message is that copper tightness is no longer only a long-term forecast. Medium-term deficits are already appearing. The ICSG projects a refined copper market deficit of around 150,000 tons in 2026. That matters because it suggests the market could tighten sooner than many investors expect. The slide also notes that mine disruptions and project delays can accelerate this shift from forecast shortage to actual market stress. In other words, if demand continues rising while supply remains fragile, price pressure could emerge well before the most aggressive long-term forecasts arrive. This slide explains why copper supply responds so slowly. The average development cycle for a new copper mine is shown at about 17 to 18 years, from discovery to first production. That timeline includes discovery, exploration, feasibility studies, permitting, financing, construction, and ramp-up. The key issue is low supply elasticity. Even if copper prices rise sharply, new output does not appear quickly. Permitting and approvals alone can take years, and financing plus construction add more delay. This means the industry cannot easily solve a tightening copper market in the short term. That long lead time is one of the strongest structural reasons copper prices could rise significantly in future years. This slide adds another layer of supply pressure: falling ore grades and rising project costs. Declining ore grades reduce output efficiency and increase the amount of material that must be processed. At the same time, new projects face much higher capital expenditures because deposits are often deeper, more complex, or located in more difficult jurisdictions. Resource discovery has also slowed, reducing the quality of the long-term project pipeline. The result is that higher long-term copper prices may be needed simply to justify building new mines. This is an important point for investors. Future supply may require a much higher incentive price than the market has historically assumed. This slide explains the role and the limits of recycling. Recycling is clearly essential and supports sustainability, circular economy goals, and reduced pressure on primary supply. But the key metric here is that recycled copper may cover only about 31% of total demand by 2040. That means even with strong recycling growth, a large supply gap remains. In other words, recycling helps but does not solve the problem. Rapid demand growth from AI, EVs, and grid expansion still requires substantial new mined copper production. The takeaway is that recycling is part of the solution, but it is not enough on its own. This slide summarizes the core copper metrics. Global copper demand is shown rising from about 28.3 million tons in 2025 to 42.4 million tons by 2040, which is more than 50% growth. The IEA also implies a project pipeline shortfall of about 30% by 2035. The ICSG expects a refined copper deficit of around 150,000 tons in 2026. Finally, average mine lead times remain about 17 to 18 years. Put together, these metrics make the bull case straightforward. Demand is growing strongly, supply pipelines are inadequate, the market is already beginning to tighten, and new production takes a very long time to deliver. This slide distills the investment case into 5 reasons copper prices could surge before 2030. First, demand growth is broad and simultaneous across AI, EVs, power grids, and clean energy. Second, supply response is slow because mine development takes about 17 years. Third, the project pipeline is insufficient for future demand. Fourth, cost inflation raises the incentive price needed to build new mines. Fifth, near-term supply deficits are already beginning to emerge. This is a strong summary slide because it shows that the copper bull case is not based on one single narrative. It is based on multiple reinforcing forces colliding at once. The final slide presents copper as a strategic global asset facing a supply-demand collision. The most important message is that copper demand has shifted from a mainly cyclical story to a structural one. AI, EVs, power grids, and energy transition are creating sustained long-term demand growth, while supply remains slow, expensive, and difficult to expand. That combination can drive a structural market shift and potentially significant price revaluation over time. The investment conclusion is that copper is not just a commodity story anymore. It is a strategic bottleneck for the global digital and energy economy, which could create compelling long-term opportunities.